Picture this, a single, relatively small kingdom, tucked deep away in the dense, practically impenetrable forests of the Malabar coast. Now, imagine that kingdom standing completely defiant against not one but two of the absolute most formidable empires of the 18th and 19th centuries. For over 3 decades, a relentless, bloody, and brilliantly executed war of resistance was fought right there in the shadows of the mountains. Now, I know it sounds like a Hollywood script, right? But it's not. This is the incredibly true historical epic of the Kurichiyas War. Let's get into it.
We are not fighting 1,000 men, but one man, Kerala Varma. Okay, let's dive into this, because that quote actually comes from Major General Arthur Wellesley. You know, the very same man who would later become the Duke of Wellington and famously crush Napoleon at Waterloo. He wrote those exact words in utter, bitter frustration, because the sheer might of the British East India Company was being humbled day after day by a single prince who just flat out refused to kneel. To really grasp the massive scale of this defiance, we need to unpack exactly how this history unfolded in this explainer.
Section 1. The Lion of Kerala. A prince refuses to flee. Section 2. Resisting the Mysore Empire. The first 20 years.
So our story centers on Kerala Varma, who would become widely known as Possassi Raja. And honestly, the sheer endurance of this man is just staggering. Back in 1773, the fierce Mysorean ruler, Hyder Ali, occupied Malabar. Most local royals immediately packed up their riches and bolted south, not Possassi Raja. In 1774, at just 21 years old, he takes de facto control of his kingdom and vows absolute resistance. He retreats into the unforgiving forests of Purulimala and Wayanad, and for the next 20 years, fighting both Hyder Ali and later his son, the infamous Tipu Sultan, he wages a relentless guerrilla war. By 1793, the last of the Mysorean garrisons were finally expelled. Think about that. He fought an exhausting 2-decade war before the British even became his primary enemy.
But the real question here is, how on earth did a young prince with essentially zero formal standing army actually pull this off? Well, he completely rewrote the rules of who could fight. He militarized the peasantry wholesale, forging this fiercely loyal, cross-caste coalition. We're talking Nair militiamen, Thiyyas peasants, and indigenous forest tribes like the Kurichiyas bowmen and the Mullukurumas, all fighting side by side. He lived in the mud and the rain right alongside them, and in return, they gave him absolute, unflinching loyalty.
What's really interesting here is the main catalyst for this rebellion. It all came down to this staggering number, 81,000 rupees. That was the crushing, exorbitant annual tribute demanded by Mysore back in the 1780s. And the weight of that payment fell squarely on the shoulders of the local peasantry, people who had already endured years of brutal occupation. Watching his own people get squeezed literally to the breaking point, that's what pushed the Raja to launch a massive, uncompromising armed resistance.
Section 3. The East India Company Betrayal. Shifting Geopolitics. Geopolitics are never quite straightforward, are they? Having fought off the Mysoreans, the Raja actually found a temporary opportunistic ally in the British East India Company. But right around 1792, after Tipu Sultan was defeated, the EIC decided an alliance wasn't enough anymore. They wanted total supremacy. They handed down devastating new terms that essentially stripped the local monarchs of their power, reducing them to mere tax-collecting agents. The British set the land revenue, they fixed the price of pepper, and they monopolized all the local merchants. It was a blatant violation of an earlier agreement that had guaranteed Kottayam's independence.
And this sudden shift, it completely ripped his family apart. On one side, you had Varma, the Raja's uncle. He was this manipulative, highly compliant figure who basically signed away his kingdom's independence to the British just so he could skim the taxes. Then, on the exact opposite side, you had Possassi Raja. He flat out refused to accept East India Company rule. He stood his ground, actively protecting his peasants from these crushing colonial taxes and completely barring the company's agents from ever setting foot on his lands.
Section 4. Victory at Peria Pass. The Kurichiyas War begins.
So heading into this massive revolt from 1793 to 1797, we really have to ask ourselves, how did one man, relying on a makeshift army of farmers and forest tribes, manage to evade and humiliate the single greatest imperial military machine of the era for so long?
Well, and this brilliantly illustrates his tactical mastery. Possassi Raja knew better than to fight European-style pitched battles. He engineered a highly structured, almost perfect system of guerrilla logistics. First, he pulled his forces back into deep, impenetrable mountain bases. Next, his men constructed perfectly camouflaged stockades overlooking narrow, winding jungle passes. From there, highly stealthy Kurichya bowmen relentlessly attacked enemy supply chains. And finally, the whole operation relied on an absolute wall of silence from the local peasantry, entirely starving the British of any actionable intelligence. It was like a giant puzzle the British just couldn't solve.
This entire strategy culminated in the absolutely horrific 1797 ambush at Paria Pass. Imagine an East India Company force of 1,100 heavily armed men, led by Major Cameron, marching straight into a narrow gorge. They were completely blind to the fact that the Raja's troops were silently watching them from hidden stockades on both sides. The second the trap was sprung, it was a slaughter. The British forces were completely decimated. They lost their commanders, their artillery, their supplies, and even their Union colors.
The ultimate death toll of this initial 4-year revolt is just mind-blowing. The East India Company lost over 1,000 European soldiers and 3,000 native sepoys. The losses were so disastrously high that Tipu Sultan was actually writing letters to the French, openly mocking the British military. The situation got so desperate that the top brass of the Bombay government had to do the unthinkable. In 1797, they officially sued Pazi Raja for peace, fully agreeing to return his lands and cancel all their warrants.
Section 5. The Final Insurgency. The Cat and Mouse Game. Naturally, that peace was incredibly fragile. By 1800, after Tipu Sultan was killed, the EIC saw an opening and moved to officially annex Wayanad. Pazi Raja didn't hesitate. He instantly went right back to war. And this sets the stage for an epic, almost cinematic showdown between two truly brilliant military commanders. On the British side, you have Arthur Wellesley commanding a massive, highly modernized presidency army. On the rebel side, Pazi Raja, who was now rallying unemployed Mysorean soldiers, Mapila leaders, and powerful local nobles to his cause. It was a lethal, high-stakes game of cat and mouse played across the dense jungles of Malabar.
And the rebels struck with terrifying audacity. In 1802, a commander named Edachana Kungan, alongside just 150 Kurichya bowmen, launched an insane surprise attack on the Panamaram fort. They wiped out the entire British garrison and seized hundreds of muskets. The news of this victory spread like wildfire. It proved to everyone that the British were bleeding, and almost overnight, 3,000 brand new volunteers flocked to the Raja's army.
Now, let's move to and see how this builds, because the military escalation required to handle this was entirely unprecedented. To counter exactly one man, the East India Company had to flood the entire region with troops. By 1804, they had amassed a staggering 13,000 soldiers just in Malabar. It got so bad that some Bombay regiments took such heavy casualties they had to be completely withdrawn, just so they wouldn't be permanently wiped out.
Eventually, the EIC realized that conventional warfare just wasn't working, so they got ruthless. They brought in sub-collector Thomas Hervey Baber, a man completely driven by personal vengeance. Baber entirely changed the playbook. He instituted massive blockades to starve the rebels out. He slapped astronomical bounties on the Raja and his top commanders. But the most devastating move? He created the Kolgar, a deeply hated, irregular force of local collaborators who were literally paid to hunt down their own people. The British finally started closing the net, not through military brilliance, but through sheer exhaustion and betrayal.
Section 6, Legacy of a King, the final stand at Mavala Thodar.
Ultimately, betrayal is always the hardest enemy to defeat. By late 1805, the Raja was forced into wandering the deepest parts of the forest with only a handful of loyal guards. On November 30th, guided by a local informant who had been bought off by the British, EIC troops ambushed the Raja's camp right by a small stream. A short, incredibly brutal gunfight erupted, and Pazi Raja was fatally wounded. As a minor EIC official, a local man working for the British, stepped forward to approach him, the dying king raised his gun one last time and delivered his final, defiant words. "Do not come too close to my dying body and pollute it." He was uncompromising, right to his very last breath.
So what does this all mean? Why does this history matter for us today? Well, Pazi Raja led the absolute longest insurgency against the East India Company in Indian history. He was a pioneer who proved that a unified, militarized peasantry could literally hold a global superpower at bay for decades, and his legacy became this towering symbol of freedom that went on to deeply inspire the 20th century independence movements throughout Kerala. But I want to leave you with one final, incredibly profound thought. Remember Arthur Wellesley? He spent years out in those Malabar jungles, constantly being outmaneuvered by Pazi Raja. Well, military historians have actually noted that Wellesley took the harsh lessons he learned about guerrilla warfare and logistics in India, and he used those exact same tactics years later to defeat Napoleon Bonaparte in Europe. Which really makes you wonder, if the great victor of Waterloo essentially learned his trade from a rebel prince in India, how much of our world's history has been secretly shaped by the brilliant defiance of indigenous fighters we almost never hear about? Think about that for a second. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning the past, and until next time, history awaits.